facilitates.
Stop there, said hi.
It's all done on Zoom.
Pregnant twins.
And, so I'm actually doing my first one tonight for Apple.
Except for number 4, got number 4 and 5.
But yeah, they said they did work with like Apple, Amazon, Microsoft.
Isn't that awesome?
It's out there.
Companies. I mean,
Yeah, I'm doing one this week for the Pacific Life Foundation.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, so I mean, it's pretty well.
I should let you guys who are on Zoom know, we do live stream to YouTube. So if you want to watch it afterward, it should be archived on there.
Oh, I know.
can they do like?
You know, we're there just like on the trampoline or on diaper bags and
Because then you have
strollers.
to give you a social security number if you go pay in like Bitcoin.
It's 4 and we've got a quorum, so if you want to start.
Works, yeah. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. It is April 14th, 2021. 19th, sorry. I was looking at the wrong date spot. It was the 19th of 2021 today. And we are going to get started with this meeting of the Fergus Falls Port Authority. And we'll start by approving the regular and closed meeting minutes from our last meeting on March 15th. Anyone have any comments, questions, concerns about the minutes? Or does anyone have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll offer that.
Caroline, thank you. Do we have a second?
I'll second them.
Thank you, Anthony. All in favor of approving those regular and closed minutes, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. And that carries. Then we will go to Clara for a dairy update.
Yeah, so I was hoping for slightly more of an update today, but we just got the survey information back from Anderson Land Surveying. It is with the engineering department currently, so I have not seen a draft of it yet, but I'm hoping to see it tomorrow at the latest, and then we can move ahead with our appraisal process.
Okay. Could you send us an update when you get the information? Okay, great, thank you. Well, that was quick and painless. Then we're gonna jump right in with our old friend Amy Baldwin is here with us today and her team. Virtually or not?
I'll just start talking. All right. Good afternoon. Thanks for having us here today, both myself from Otter Tail County and, as mentioned, others from Minnesota Housing Partnership, as well as other county support are joining us remotely as well. And it's just pulling up my presentation. Okay, all right, well, not too much that's critical as I get started here. So handed out additionally was a brief outline of the work that we're going to do today collectively. But overall wanted to provide an update of the housing priorities and efforts at Otter Tail County. So I'll kind of kick off the front end. And then Minnesota Housing Partnership, who we have been working with for a number of months now, who are joining us remotely, will do a little more focused discussion around housing at a community level here in Fergus Falls, as well as the region. And then our goal is to help inform what both the Port Authority and the county can do moving forward to assist with local housing opportunities or initiatives or priorities. So to start off, maybe while we're pulling up that presentation, if to help folks joining us remotely to know who's all in the room, since we're kind of in a large area here, I think that would be helpful. But again, Amy Baldwin with Otter Tail County, and I'll turn over.
Yes, I am Tom Roofer. I'm the chair of the Port Authority, also a member of the City Council. And why don't we go to Rebecca and then Table and then back.
Hi, I don't know if people can see me, but Rebecca Lynn Peterson on the Port Authority, on the board of Greater Fergus Falls, and I'm employed by West Central Initiative. So looking forward to this presentation.
I'm Kelvin Benson. I'm with Congressman Fishbach's office.
Bill Sunmore here, Finance Director for the city and Treasurer for the Port Authority.
Andrew Brunson, City Administrator.
Brent Thompson with the Port Authority and on the City Council.
Anthony Hicks with the Port Authority and the City Council.
Caroline Gustafson with the Port Authority and City Council. I am Bridget Leonard and I am with the Port Authority.
And I think Jill is important enough to introduce herself.
It's a silent majority.
All right, so to kind of start off, talking about why an investment in housing and why is that important to us. And at the county, we talk about the need and desire to have safe, decent, affordable housing that meets the needs of all of our residents, our prospective residents, and ensuring that we have are able to meet the needs of the broader housing priorities and preferences of those folks as well. You've, I'm sure, all seen and heard about the on the map strategies, the work that the county has done for a number of years in making sure that the county is front and center when people are looking for a place to relocate. And that's especially important because our population growth is lagging our peer counties. Yep. There we go. Okay, so and as noted, we are looking at a projected, with that lack of growth in population, 4.6 reduction in our available workforce. And if you've even exacerbated further now is a challenge in finding qualified workers to fill the jobs that we have today, let alone support the growth that so many of our businesses and organizations are looking at. And again, that current supply of housing is just not enough to meet the needs and preferences of our newcomers as well as our existing residents. And then finally, the growth and preservation of the property tax base as kind of a core economic development strategy. So we can flip to the next slide. And so as mentioned with that population growth, as we look at our peer counties, how we have grown from 2010 to 2019, you'll see we lag some of our neighboring counties by a significant number in our peer growth. And then going to the next slide shows that labor force numbers. So this is looking out into the coming 10 years and showing a reduction, even including some projected growth in overall population, that we still have a decline in our available labor force going forward. So just a couple of stats there. And then the next two highlight that vacancy rate. So this is numbers coming from the Maxfield study that the Housing and Redevelopment Authority commissioned last year, showing that we're well below that market equilibrium of vacancy rates, looking at 5% being that equilibrium, and looking at both affordable and as well as market rate vacancies well below that. And then the next slide relates to the for sale market, and generally you want to see about a 6 month of inventory that's available at any given time. And these are for all of Fergus Falls addresses, not just city limits of Fergus Falls, but this came from MLS data from 2020. And again, seeing very low inventory of for sale housing out on the market. And then the final stat on the next slide shows the affordability. And these are actual sale prices or average sale prices that Fergus Falls has experienced over the last 15 years. And you'll see that line continuing to go up. And they'll get talked more about with MHP, but that how important that housing affordability and using lowercase a, I guess I like to say, from affordability to be affordable to our workers and to our residents, not uppercase A, which has a different meaning to it. Next slide. So we kind of talked about the why. Why are we looking at housing? And then moving on to the who is doing it. And it's everyone from on this slide showing to some of our public and nonprofit partners, everyone from the state and certainly up into the federal level as well. And looking down to the county, the Housing and Redevelopment Authority in the city as well. And then our private sector partners being just as important, if not more important, and in being a part of the solution towards housing. And then just thinking about the alignment with the long-range strategic plan that the county has recently adopted. Within this plan, there's a prioritization of housing growth and redevelopment. And the two main areas that were identified as barriers within that plan are the availability and the affordability of housing. So as was demonstrated by the data that we just talked about and reviewed, that those are two barriers that were heard as concerns as that plan was developed the prior 2 years. Some specific housing needs that were identified within that plan again, affordable housing, well, that's capitalized. I would say it's a lowercase affordable, the affordability of housing for everybody. Preservation or rehabilitation of our existing housing stock. How do we preserve that housing that we already have, which is one of our biggest pieces of infrastructure throughout the county? And then more specifically, the life cycle or senior housing needs throughout the county.
Amy, what's the definition of like life cycle and senior housing? What does life cycle mean? I mean, I know what life cycle means, but what does it mean in this context?
Sure, and there is actually another slide in that when MHP does a presentation that shows the continuum of housing. So it's really that you'd have options to move from, you know, maybe a rental into a home ownership, and then beyond that into ultimately a, you know, a nursing home, going from independent senior
Right, okay,
living.
thanks.
Yeah, kind of having that. So this means, yeah, life cycle from a person's life cycle, not the life cycle of the home.
Right.
All right, so how else are we doing this? And not news to, I don't think, anyone here today, but the county introduced about 1.5 years ago, the Big Build Initiative. And this is the housing growth plan to build new, preserve, or rehabilitate 5,000 housing units within the county by 2025. And again, this aligns back to the county's long-range strategic plan. There's 4 actions within this initiative that I'll give just kind of a brief overview on. The first is increasing the construction of new housing units. And one key program within there that we've been talking about a lot is the property tax rebate program. And that's specifically to spur new single family investment, and with the goal of opening up lower value existing home stock to new home buyers. We know how expensive it is to build a new home from start. And so one of those goals was to provide home ownership opportunities at a lower price point. And as you know, it's a rebate of the county and the city's portion of the property tax increase that goes in there. Looking at 2020 progress towards this goal, we saw about $39 million of housing investment throughout the county. And that's both new construction and rehabilitation, totaling 656 new or rehabbed units. Looking at an increase, we didn't have, I'll say, 2019 data. We're still kind of pulling together what our data sources were going to be. And so while we know there was an increase in new starts in 2020, we also, you know, saw an increase. Some of our 2019 data isn't always the most solid numbers to compare from. So we'll continue to track those numbers as we go forward, but those are kind of a snapshot of what we did see in 2020. All right, and then the second area is building partnerships and expanding capacity. And we know that partnerships are key in solving multifaceted, complex issues like housing. There isn't, if the market was going to pick this up and solve it, it wouldn't be an issue. It wouldn't be why we're talking about it here today. And again, the inclusion of public, private, nonprofit organizations in solutions and ways to address the issue are critical. Just as an example of one that we saw last year that was a great partnership was the city of Otter Tail. They had identified a number of lots that they own throughout the city, that the city had kind of a smattering of residential land, kind of as well as an opportunity to purchase a subdivision that what needed to be replatted, it couldn't be built out as it was proposed by an initial developer. And so we provided from the county a matching grant for the city to would identify these opportunities to take advantage of them and get them to that next step. And they had prioritized housing within their own budget because they had the match dollars to do it. So they acquired that subdivision and they're replatting it. They also had a home that was donated to them by the bank, and it was an uninhabitable housing unit that the bank had come into ownership of and didn't want to maintain ownership of. So the grant helped match funds to demolish that, and they have already resold that lot with a new home going up there this year. So they are selling these lots for $1 as they're getting them up and running. So, and we're also helping them promote the program on our larger platform to make a bigger awareness of the opportunity that Otter Tail is providing. So it really, again, expanded their capacity of what they were able to do. elevating the voice of the opportunity broader than what they're doing or what they would be able to do alone. And then, leveraging those dollars. So it's just one example from last year.
Amy, how many lots?
Total lots will be, they have a few scattered. So I think there's 5 that are kind of scattered. And then that subdivision, I think will be 12, I believe. I'd have to look that up.
Okay, somewhere between 15 and 20.
Yeah, I would say that's a fair estimate.
And do those lots have infrastructure in place?
Some do and some don't. So obviously the home that was demoed had infrastructure. And so that one was one that's ready to go.
Okay.
The new subdivision does not. And
Okay.
so that's an area they'll be building out the infrastructure. So our funds help them acquire that land. Another area they owned, it was at kind of the end of a road. So they're extending a road to some city-owned land that will free up 3 additional lots there.
Okay.
And so those are available now. They were able to get that road. It was just a road infrastructure that needed to be put in there. So it was kind of a whole continuum from ready to build to needing the infrastructure.
Okay, and I'm still working on my understanding of how all this works, but so the lots that'll be sold for $1 that don't have infrastructure, would there be assessments put on that?
That
as they
area
normally
will,
would?
yeah, they're actually creating a tax increment financing district to help offset their assessments.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Right. And then the 4th area of action within the big build is to seek funding opportunities. I'm sorry, the 3rd area is to seek funding opportunities to support development, ownership, and reinvestment. And we work to actively identify those funding streams that might come into play with the opportunities that we hear at the community level. So every community is unique when we talk to them, and each have a different identified opportunities. So as we hear about a funding stream that might be a match for Fergus or Otter Tail or Battle Lake or whoever it might be, depending on their unique scenario. Some cities own lots, like in the case of Otter Tail. In Battle Lake, the example I have up here, there was a privately owned subdivision that has residential lots that's been kind of just languishing. It hasn't had new growth happen. And they had identified the biggest challenge there was the cost of the home was higher than it would appraise for. So that's called the value gap. And so if you were getting an appraisal to get a mortgage, you'd have to come in with even more cash in order to build a home there because of that gap. And Minnesota Housing does have what's called a value gap grant program, but it's highly competitive, and you have to have a market study and data to support it. And so it started at that, said, hey, Minnesota Housing has this program, but then as you back up, how do you get to have a competitive application? And that's we're partnering with West Central Initiative on the housing study and University of Minnesota Extension on some survey work about what people's needs and what they wish they could find in Otter Tail or in Battle Lake is helping to inform a competitive application that is now being drafted. So it took a year to get there, but it all started with that inquiry about what opportunity is there to help fill this particular need. So, so we'll be through the county's Housing and Redevelopment Authority supporting an application to Minnesota Housing in coordination with the city of Battle Lake for privately owned lots. So just to make that distinction and their opportunity. All right, and almost wrapped up here, but the final area of action is to advocate for increased funding in support of housing. And through legislative advocacy, the county, as well as with our partner organizations like the Greater Minnesota Partnership, which Anna from West Central Initiative also serves on the board of that, as do I. So we have good representation that they really bring forward. It's a lobbying effort to bring forward the housing challenges specific to Greater Minnesota. So we've been able to at least get some bills introduced. We'll see what happens. It's a challenging year as always at the legislature, but we've also been really thankful to have our legislative federal partners talking to us about these and being able to help tell our story about the challenges we have, especially in connection back to our workforce. And so we continue that work as well. And then finally, just to close, as we go forward, we'll continue to identify partnership opportunities and projects that we can help support and continue to communicate and market the opportunities that we do have today, and as well continue engagements like such as this, and certainly track the data to continue to show our progress to the 2025 goal. So those are the areas that I wanted to share, just to give a little update on what we're doing here at the county. But then I want to turn it over to our folks at Minnesota Housing Partnership, which I realized we forgot to introduce everyone on the screen when we were doing introductions. So with that, I will turn it over to either Elizabeth or Ella to kick off introductions on online and to start your side of the presentation.
Great, thank you. I will try to share my screen now.
And while Ella is getting that set up, I'll introduce myself because Ella will be leading the presentation. My name is Elizabeth Glidden, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of Minnesota Housing Partnership. And together with Ella, we're really glad to be working with Otter Tail on this assignment. And over to you, Ella.
Great. Can you see, can everyone see my slides? Does that show up all right?
Looks good here.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Amy, for that introduction. I think, you know, we're going to be echoing some of the same points that she brought up, and as well as bringing up some new data and information for you all. So quick agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about how MHP got connected with Otter Tail. We'll talk about some of the housing challenges, some definitions, do a brief overview of housing development, that process, and then move into some questions and discussion. So first, a little bit of background on MHP. We are a 30-year plus organization, and we have three main departments that we work through. So the first one is research. You may have heard of our State of Housing report that we do, and that one, the most recent one, just came out a few weeks ago, so please look it up if you haven't seen it already. And we also do county reports and regional reports using original research and data. We use a lot of that to inform our policy advocacy, so Elizabeth works closely on that, both at the state level and at the federal level. And then we work directly with communities through engagements such as this, to help local groups achieve housing development goals, other community development projects. And we are rooted in Minnesota. We actually work nationwide, but we have a lot of experience all over the state, including some past engagements in Otter Tail County. So we had a team in our Housing Institute a few years ago. That's our peer-to-peer learning program. We also worked in the county through the USDA Rural Community Development Initiative. And then a few years ago, we helped fund some housing studies in the county and some of the cities. And so this engagement, we are working with the CDA starting about a year ago. The CDA applied for our Strengthening Rural Communities Technical Assistance Program. They received the award last June, and since August, we've been working together, and this just goes through November of this year. So over that time period, we are focusing on community engagement through engagements such as this, and then helping developing some resources, including possibly a local housing trust fund. And as Amy outlined, we are guided by county objectives. So the long range strategic plan and the big build, you know, we want to make sure that everything we're doing is aligning with those programs. So we'll just do some sort of grounding ourselves in definitions. Amy was already talking about this whole uppercase versus lowercase of A for affordable. And so I think, you know, we are also going to be talking about quote unquote lowercase a affordable. And when we say that, that means that housing costs are less than 30% of a household's income. So whether that's rent or mortgage payments, we don't want a household to be spending more than 30% on housing. And if they're paying more than that, they are considered to be cost burdened. And that idea of cost burden is important because when families are paying too much for housing, they don't have enough to spend on the other things they need. Food, transportation, healthcare are often things that suffer, which, of course, has impacts on quality of life, and it also has economic impacts in the local community if residents don't have money to spend at local businesses. And in other ways, housing really does support economic development. This is a little snapshot from an infographic that the county just made. Go to their website, it looks great. There's a lot more information you can see on it, but it's really important that housing has local economic impacts both through the construction process as well as once it's in place through both housing residents as well as providing jobs in the housing management industry. And then another definition that we throw around a lot is workforce housing. And when we say workforce housing, we just mean straightforward housing for workers. And so that may change depending on your community. So workforce housing should be affordable to the people who are working in your community. And so that depends on the local wages and salaries that are being paid in the area. And then another thing that we think is important to acknowledge is that structural racism really has had an impact on housing outcomes and sort of where we are today with housing disparities. And so you'll see that this is, all around the state of Minnesota as well as around the country. People of color are less likely to own homes, and they are more likely to be severely cost burdened and to suffer from homelessness. And now we'll get into some Otter Tail data. We'll get into some Fergus Falls specific data in a little bit. But first of all, this is from our most recent state of the county report. So this is using 2019 data. And it's actually interesting for renters. Otter Tail County is a little bit of an anomaly in the state in that income has kept pace with rent. So that's a good sign. Most places we're finding rents are rising way faster than income, which is troubling. But I don't think it necessarily means we're out of the woods there. We are seeing that homeowners are facing a little bit more troubles in Otter Tail County. So you'll see that home values over the past 20 years have increased over 50%, whereas incomes have only increased 20%.
This is the one way round. This home value 2000 is 125,000 and home value 2019 is 190.
Right. Yeah. So home values have increased about 50% since 2000. Is that making
so today? So what is it? So you're saying 2021 they're more expensive than 2020?
From then 2000. Yeah. So our data is comparing the year 2000 and 2019.
Are they the one way around, or am I not seeing it right?
I read it as 2020 right away.
Yeah.
It took me a second to figure out, but if you flipped the whole line with itself, it makes sense.
Right. It's 2000. Sorry, that might be confusing. So 20 years ago, 2000.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I see what you mean.
A little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So yeah, and I think that this number, it's one of those things where if you're already a homeowner, that's great. You'll love to see that kind of growth. But this really presents an obstacle to first-time homeowners who are trying to get into the market. If incomes aren't rising quickly enough, it just makes that really hard to achieve. And then we can also see again those race disparities. So of homeowners in Otter Tail County, 97% are white and only 3% are people of color. And then that cost burden issue is something that we are seeing around the county. So that's particularly common with seniors, especially once people are on fixed incomes. It's very common to become cost burdened. And then severe cost burden, which is when a household is paying over half of their income in housing costs. That's affecting almost 1 in 4 renter and about almost 1 in 10 homeowners. And another thing that we're seeing is a little bit of a mismatch between that workforce housing idea. So the wages that local workers are earning and what they're able to afford for housing. So these are some of the most in-demand jobs in the Northwest region more broadly. So you'll see registered nurses, that's sort of an outlier. They're doing pretty well compared to other occupations, but things like housekeepers, personal care aides, nursing assistants, these people can barely afford a two-bedroom apartment, and really home ownership is out of reach at the salaries that they are making right now. And this pattern is we're seeing it in Fergus Falls as well. You'll see that over 40% of households in Fergus Falls are making less than $35,000 a year. So those are people that might be struggling to find housing that they can afford. And then cost burden is also something we're seeing in the city itself. So 30% of all households in Fergus Falls are cost burdened. And you'll see that renters in particular are affected by that. So almost half of renters are paying too much for housing, and homeowners as well. We're also seeing a growing senior population. Almost 40% of Fergus Falls is over the age of 55. So that's suggesting, we're going to see more people possibly moving into that fixed income category and having less to pay for housing. And then, we also have the housing stock itself is aging. So over half of homes in Fergus Falls are over 50 years old. So that's, this is an issue all around the state. And we're seeing that means we need to invest in our existing housing as well as in new housing as well. And so Fergus Falls, a couple of years ago, there was a housing task force. Just wanted to highlight some recommendations that came out of that. I think this echoes pretty closely what Amy was talking about. These goals are around increasing housing units, supporting affordability, maintaining existing homes, and then promoting some new housing resources and opportunities. And one thing we want to highlight, again, building on what Amy was saying, is that a healthy housing market has a variety of housing types. So this, everything from apartments and townhomes to single family homes that accommodate both different incomes, but also different lifestyles as people, their lives change and different housing fits different needs. And then we also have supportive housing for both seniors as well as veterans and people with disabilities. And even within senior housing, there's really a wide continuum of different types of needs you might have. So everything from memory care, assisted living, to things like independent living communities, and even aging in place where you're just doing upgrades to existing homes to allow people to stay in their homes. So, zooming out a bit into what we're seeing statewide and really nationwide is people sort of are wondering, why is housing so unaffordable? And it really is an economic issue. So we're seeing an increased demand for housing. We're hearing, there's definitely a lot of workers needed in places like Otter Tail County. Reduced supply, a lot of that is because of this aging housing stock. But costs are rising both in urban and rural areas. Land is expensive, construction materials are very expensive, operating costs, and then that mismatch. So the incomes and therefore the rents that you could charge are just not going to match the housing costs that it costs to build new housing. So we're finding that means that the market alone isn't producing the housing that everyone needs. And, it is really hard to build new housing. There's, you could come up with 100 different reasons. These are sort of 4 big buckets that we talk about. Again, those costs are really important. The people and the firms are also really important. I think that rural areas often find that sometimes it's hard to get developers who are interested in working in the area, who have the capacity, who can find the construction workers and the trade workers. That financial impact definitely is part of that as well. Developers need to be able to make a return on their investment. So what are the interest rates? What other funding incentives are available? And then all the local factors. So the rents, vacancy rates, what's the land available, what's the condition of the land, as well as policies and regulations that can either incentivize or disincentivize housing development. And so, I think that you all have been thinking, I'm sure, about many of these things. When we're looking at developing a particular site, these are sort of some broad buckets that we think about. So is it consistent with local plans and goals? What kind of community engagement needs to happen, to figure out both what the community needs and is looking for, and communicate goals and ideas out to the community. So it kind of goes both ways. That partnerships piece. So what are developers you can partner with? Are there employers who are interested in participating, other nonprofits? Funding and resources, always important. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. Timelines, what's the priority in terms of the other projects and priorities of something like the Port Authority? Is there other competing priorities? Is there an opportunity to phase development? And then the site conditions as well. And so on that site conditions, I know that this is something that I hear is top of mind for you all. So we have those utilities and infrastructure, things like environmental testing and remediation, and then that site planning. And I think that these are things where part of it is deciding, how much or which of these does the Port Authority want to take on yourself in order to attract a developer, or, prioritize finding a partner who might take on some of these duties on your behalf. And then funding, there's a lot of different funding options. There's it sort of depends on your plans. A little bit of what you decide to build will dictate what funding you're eligible, but also what funding is available might help you decide what's feasible to build. So at the local level, there are, city and county resources. At the state level, we've got Minnesota Housing and Deed, both have lots of programs. Some of those like the housing tax credit is a federal program, but administered through the state. The American Rescue Plan, we are seeing and anticipating probably more funding for housing through some of these more recent bills from the federal level. And then, private funding sources are also becoming more common in terms of supporting housing. So just wrapping up, a little bit of a preview into what MHP is looking at over the next couple of months. So we have already done some presentations in Otter Tail County. We are planning on doing probably one more this spring, and then we're hoping to come up with a report and some recommendations this summer based on our conversations to just help get a sense of the directions for housing investment and housing need around the county. So thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it, and would love to take any questions. And we also have some discussion questions we'd love to pose to you. But first, if there's anything we can clarify, happy to do so.
Thank you, Ella. Does anyone have any questions?
You're on it. We used to. I think one of the realtors used to do a vacancy kind of apartments in Fergus. Has anybody seen that lately? I think John Olson used to do it. I know he's retired, but I think, but
to my knowledge, no one picked that up after he retired. It was just something he did.
Right. Do we know what the vacancy rate on apartments is or not?
As a county, there was an assessment with as I mentioned in my presentation, that would have been early 2020 data though, so not post-pandemic or in the pandemic, and that was about 3.5%
Right.
for apartment buildings.
Thanks.
I just have like a formula question. So you mentioned the help. Can you hear me okay? Like Ella? Okay. I didn't hear you. So if we know kind of the average income of like Fergus Falls residents and some of those like that 35,000, and that maybe there's a 2-income family, and then what is the kind of housing cost or price then that you would look at for that, so that it's not cost burdened? Because then I'm kind of curious as to like do we have those available, or are we way too high where it's too burdensome of a cost for most families?
Right. Yeah, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but yeah, so I mean, I sort of do it a rule of thumb. So you should spend less than a third of your income, yearly, monthly, however you want to measure it. So at that $35,000 level, that's about, less than $1,000 a month that a household should be spending on at that lowest level.
And Amy, you were talking about the big build. Some of that will be affordable housing, some of it will be mixed use, the 5,000 units. Is that right? Throughout Otter Tail County?
Sure. That certainly is it's a broad, there isn't like categories that we're even, in our data tracking, we're not looking at how many of those units were affordable. A lot of the rehab was actually on affordable units with the Shuit-owned properties, so the Riverbend apartment, the rehab. I mean, that was a very significant rehab that was done there, reinvestment in that property. And then they also own a property in New York Mills that is also an affordable property. So between the two, it was well over $10 million of investment.
And actually, one thing I should clarify also when we talk about affordability is that 30% is including utilities. So, it should be rent plus water, electricity, internet, everything like that. We want that number to be under 30%.
So
And
you see wages going up? I mean, one of the issues seems that if we only have an income of 35,000, then that's not enough for housing. I mean, when will wages move accordingly? Because isn't that part of the problem?
Yeah, no, I think it's, it's definitely a both and issue. I think it's a wages issue. And that is why often when, we've been talking about small A affordability, but large A affordability as in subsidized housing, that's why that tends to have to be part of the solution for those lowest earners.
Got a bit of a technical question in regards to some of the definitions here. So you've got the goal of build, preserve, or renew. How are you guys defining housing units preserved?
Sure. We are looking at an investment of at least $20,000 in the unit.
Okay, so how does the preserve differ from the renew then? Is the renew just the remodeling of it, and then the preserve is rather than transforming it into, a shopping mall or something? I'm just missing that. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. There's not. I don't know if we have strong definitions around those, but it's keeping it in housing. So.
Do we know what the average cost of new build was in big build?
Not all of our cities have permits, and the townships generally do not have permits. So that would provide the estimated construction cost.
But isn't it on the application form?
It is. Yep. I would say people were didn't always know because they didn't have bids yet. I wouldn't put a lot of value in the accuracy of that number. We can pull it and provide that. We do have it tracked, but I don't know. We will be in subsequent years know the assessed values on them. So that's what we'll be looking in the future when the assessed values for those new homes come out. We'll have that as a tracking mechanism.
Yeah, I don't have numbers on that, but one point I will make is I know that we're hearing that, a lot of what's driving increased costs is lumber prices, it's things like that. And one of the issues is that it's just as expensive to build somewhere like Fergus Falls as it is to build in the metro area, but in the metro area, they can charge higher rents. And so that makes it a little bit more feasible for a developer, at least to make that math work.
Yeah, good discussion. Good questions. Thank you. Do you, Amy, then do you want to continue on or explain the worksheet that?
Yeah, yep, I can go ahead and do that if that works, Ella. Yep. All right, so just want to confirm everyone has the worksheet that was handed out that has some conversation questions on the back. See nods. Maybe one more. All right, so these questions are designed for, both to spur conversation, further conversation coming out of what has already started, but also for you to provide written feedback if you'd wish to do it in a written way, or take additional notes that maybe don't get expressed verbally during the balance of our time together. So we'll take notes based on people's conversations, but again, these are just, as you're feeling today, not data-driven sort of answers to these questions, but just putting the first one out there. What are the top 3 housing needs that you see in Fergus Falls? That could be, certain types of housing, demographics of people who have unmet housing needs, and then kind of why do you see that as a priority? Jump on that yet?
So
Yeah.
the renters, for example, some of them could probably own, maybe. Why don't they?
Well, it can be just a lifestyle preference to not have the ownership, the obligations of being a homeowner. Maybe they aren't sure if they're going to stay. Maybe the type of product they would like to buy isn't available. That the type of home that would have the layout or the location that they would want. And there's a lot of factors that might go into that.
Would you guess that the ones that maybe are kind of more or less stuck in renting because they don't have almost the cash on hand for a down payment, and that's the reason they can't get out?
Certainly could be. Yeah.
And perceptions around down payments are a bit off. Housing studies in 2020 found that the average person believes you need 15% for a down payment. So a lot of people don't even look. Right now, you can get conventional home financing up to $250,000 at most banks, under 3% interest with only 3.5% now. That's kind of standard right now. The whole paradigm of you need double-digit percentages of down payments is kind of been shifted, and that has proven to be a barrier in some circumstances to people even pursuing home ownership.
Right.
And we have talked a lot about education around that piece and the different programs that are available. So, yep.
Well, and right now too, we just need more housing. I mean, houses are going on the market, getting 9 offers in a day for 20% over what they would have been a year ago. So, but then with building materials that cost, a 2x4 at Home Depot has gone up from $2 and something to over $6. Yeah, so it's
Yeah, because OSB, when I bought it a little over a year ago, was $8 a sheet. Last time I checked, it was 36.
Yep.
And that all started when they all started last summer. The minute the riots happened, they started sending it out to all the places where they were boarding everything up. Then the construction hit and that raised it up. Then the hurricanes hit and then that raised it up. So.
Or just keep it into the market.
And, I remember there was a Habitat house that was built just down the street from us. And I remember having a conversation with Stan Kerrigan at the grand opening, and, him talking about the shortage of skilled trade workers too, that you have to pay, trade workers so much in order to, to get them on the payroll, because there's just a shortage and it's highly in demand. So that's another aspect of it that needs to be addressed, because that's pushing subcontractor costs through the roof. No pun intended. Anybody else have any thoughts on?
Well, I'm just going to throw this out there because it's not my idea, but I thought it was a great one. So I think a lot of you know Justin Nepo. And one of his ideas for like an unused motel in the Wap area was to charge people like $1,000 for rent for housing. 500 of that would go into an escrow. 500 would go towards utilities so they could build up some kind of equity to put a down payment on a house. And that, but they had to agree to stay in the area, right? I don't know if that's ever come to fruition, but it was one of the things he was kicking around, which, I mean, maybe it's not an issue when you can get a mortgage for a lot less these days, but people don't always have a down payment for their first house.
Yeah, even that 3% is still a huge stumbling block for so many people.
Especially when the average home was going for over 250.
Yeah, I mean, it's for a first-time homeowner to get into the market right now, it's just ridiculous. And then, you have to look at credit scores too, people that live paycheck to paycheck may not necessarily have the best credit score, and that's really gonna affect your ability to get a mortgage and an ability to afford it depending on the credit rate you get. So, or the interest rate you get. So do we,
So would one of our priorities be housing for like under a specific threshold?
Yeah, however you would define like affordable single family houses.
yeah, perhaps as a multiple of income? I mean, I'm trying to think back to what we were making when we bought our first house, and I don't know what the right answer is to that question, but we definitely need to make it easier for people to get their first home, to be able to afford it.
This is a bit more of a policy question for the housing partnership people. How much of these increased housing costs are coming from housing size group? I mean, an average new built home in 1951 was just over 1,000 square feet. Nowadays, it's well over 2,000 square feet. So how much of this massive expansion of housing costs we've seen in the last 20 years is due to the fact that houses are twice as big as they used to be?
This is Elizabeth from Minnesota Housing Partnership. I do think that is a very good point. Kind of personal preference around size of home and how that's gone up. But I will say there are many reports on types of costs that have driven things up. I think Ella did a good job in articulating that the challenging thing is there's no silver bullet to identifying what is that biggest driver cost. And it's a lot of costs spread out over a lot of areas. You've just had a lot of discussion of the construction costs and how that's a unique factor right now with the market. I think that's a good example.
And I mean, one thing we didn't even touch on, which I'm sure you all are very aware of, is second homes and vacation homes, and obviously those affect the market in a lot of areas.
Speaking to house size, it would be interesting to know the correlation between, there's just fixed costs to get into home building, and then, as you increase the size of that home, you get a commensurate increase in value, if that's a thought that's possible to follow. I guess I don't. But to start out with, say you build a 1,000 square foot house, how much more does it cost to build a 2,000 square foot house? I mean, is it twice as much? That would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I don't know that one exactly. I mean, I do know that at a certain point, once you're going into home ownership, perhaps one of the reasons is that you want more space and you have a family. And so I've heard in other contexts, people trying to build small homes as a way to build more units, especially single family homes. And the units are too small and nobody wants them. And so there's a certain livability factor as well.
Well, when we tried to sell our house in Duluth, open concept and granite countertops. Always invest in granite countertops.
I'm just, one thing I'm kind of curious is, my house on Lincoln Avenue, when I bought that one, you might what called it a house of disrepair. But it had a solid foundation, very solidly built. And we paid 38,000 for that. And a lot of times you played that for almost a lot. Now, I mean, how many homes are like that in the Fergus Falls, let alone the Otter Tail area? Because I mean, if you buy something like that and you get it at that price because of disrepair, you already have your sewer, you already have your water, you already have your foundation. It's literally takes sweat equity of about $5,000 to dispose of all and literally gut it down to the studs. And then you still have your mainframe. I mean, I was talking to Leland once before, and he says there is stuff in the county to help people with stuff like that. Because then you're already got your foundation, you already got your utilities, and you already got the main structure of your home. And shiplap on the outside of the house is a heck of a lot better than OSB. And so you pretty much got a very solidly built frame that you just now have to pay a contractor to come in and put electrical, plumbing, siding, and finish the interior, which is going to be considerably cheaper than starting from scratch with a new foundation and all the assessments with all your water, sewer, and everything else. I'm just curious what kind of availability of homes are like that in the Fergus Falls or Otter Tail area, that people who just want to be able to put the sweat equity, gut it down to the studs, and then bring in a contractor to just say, okay, we got a fresh slate here to build something a little cheaper.
Yeah, and I think, we hear from a number of communities that, when those homes that are in that lower price point, 50,000-ish, they're getting purchased by cash buyers who are coming in to purchase them and then rent them. May not be making the repairs that probably should be happening in some cases. There's a home in Pelican Rapids right now that's the conversation about what are the options. And that's my experience, what we're hearing in, again, many of the communities, that when those homes are coming. So where is that, is that an opportunity that the community here would identify as a need to try to capture those homes before they go into that cash buyer situation and then be rented out? I mean, that's,
yeah, because
that would be, for you guys to help start identifying those priorities and what role that you see you could play in that market transaction that's happening.
And that was part of the reason why I even went forward, that I pushed for having these inspections of rental properties. Hopefully we could force some of the, landlords who don't take good care of their properties to just put them back out on the market and get them into single families where they could get a house once they're all done, which would have considerable equity if they're able to get into it, and then that renovates and then brings up your tax base and everything else. And, in the past, that's another thing I looked at, is how do we stop these things from getting turned back into rental properties and get them in the homes of families who want to be able to say, hey, it's a lot cheaper to go in and gut this thing and rebuild it, which helps the city with the tax base and everything else, and gets them into a home that's something that I've been worried about for a long time, is keeping these things from getting turned into rental properties.
Has there been any more discussion on community land trusts? Are some cities going that way? We've had this discussion kind of before. And another thing with renters too, they're less likely to stick around, right? That's one of the stats, is they're less likely to make home here. So if we could get them into a home too.
Yeah, to your first question about the land trust, so the West Central Communities Action Partnership, the CAP agency, who was in the starting stages of forming a land trust right before the pandemic hit, they kind of paused. They did get some funding and are looking more to, they started by just getting some lots identified, but they just had to kind of pause everything. And then also being impacted by now the rising construction costs, when they're at such tight margins on their builds already that they were doing before. So I think there's still an opportunity for that, especially in the changing market. So hopefully they'll get that advanced going forward.
That's typically not like a city-led or port-led type of a thing? It's a separate entity or kind of a mix or what?
Yeah, I mean, it generally a standalone agency or a partnership, to make the numbers work, you have to have a certain volume.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's probably at a core community level, you wouldn't have that volume here. Even in the Twin Cities, there's like the West Hennepin County Area Land Trust as a nonprofit. So just to give you that scale, that's the geography. Or Duluth, that was the example we talked about at the Housing Summit, over a year ago. But so that's definitely could be, again, a bit of this mix. And that's, I think, as was talked about already, there isn't a single solution that's going to address all of these. It's going to be a whole palette of solutions that are going to address these different nuggets. And it's for the community to identify, what are the solutions that are your top priorities, kind of, one of the questions here, where do you see yourselves as the Port Authority having a role or an opportunity to impact some level of these challenges that have been identified?
Coming back to the second home deal, and I mean, the county obviously has homestead. That seems to be like mellowing out or leveling out. Do you see the county kind of like charging more for a second home? Because you obviously have homesteading and then non-homestead.
So, I mean, from a valuation.
Yeah. Well, from a taxation point of view, because the rebate for homesteading seems to be shrinking.
That's a state, at the
Right.
state level, county doesn't
Right.
control over that.
So is there a way that we can charge more for a second home?
Well, the values are going up just by market, so they, in essence, will be paying a larger number. But that's not the way, but no, the state,
Yeah.
the tax structures and the tax rates
Right.
for classification. Yeah.
Right.
So I have a question about funding. We talked a little bit about state funding and federal funding like ARP and HUD, but we didn't really talk a lot about private philanthropic. Are you referring to foundations or individuals? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I think, I had foundations in mind. I think that, we're seeing it's sort of a trend now that foundations are more interested in helping with things like housing. I don't know if Elizabeth, if you have any specifics.
I think there are examples out there of employer-supported housing, but so I think those are a little bit more unique. There's other ways often employers are partners in, so I think it's a little bit situation specific, what comes to be an opportunity.
Okay. Didn't KLN and a group of businesses invest in housing?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Well, even direct employer support, we do see examples of that in Perham, for instance, locally is a good example. A number of the industries there provide down payment assistance and or especially first time home buyers, but trying to help bridge that challenge of getting even, some level of assistance. And so depending on, if you've been with the company for a certain number of years, you get support. And again, to that point about if you own a home, you're going to be more vested, and it's a small investment they feel to have someone be more committed to stay at their in their community. So so direct employer support exists. RVIG, KLN, well, I know those two for sure. So I'll just speak to those two. And then, but your other point about Perham Capital and Grow Perham, where they actually did come together to invest in housing. They own several hundred apartment units and certainly did single family development. They do have individuals moving ahead with another single family project that they're doing dual infrastructure and home construction. It's already broke ground this spring. So a new 30 units, 30 lots, I think it is, 14 acres subdivision. So that'll be has started construction now with earth moving. So that's going forward, but that's an individual local
developer who's doing that one. They're committed to 6 new single-family homes a year. That also was funded with tax increment financing for the infrastructure.
Do we know generally what's different now than 30 years ago? Because this has been an issue for 30 years, really. So I'm just, is there anything different from a statistical perspective? Or is it very similar? Does anybody know that? Because literally since the 80s, when interest rates came off, housing's been an economic development issue. I don't know if that would lead to any solutions, but
I think the one chart that Ella showed, just the overall increase in the housing costs to the increase in wages. I mean, that's been a big disconnect in the last 20 years. About going back 40 years, I don't know enough about the market at that time, but the 20-year change in that.
Right.
One addition I might make to this is a more recent point in time event, is that there's been a lot of research that post the Great Recession, so more recent years, 2008, we really got behind on what is a normal course of supply, building housing. And so that is a more recent significant point in time, but definitely one where we really got behind in supply of all levels of housing that serves economic need and housing need, and never have caught up. So we're kind of in this way behind state, and that exacerbates these other pressures around cost and income and so forth.
Maybe to close out the kind of the discussion and focusing more on where do you as the Port Authority see your role and what work you could play as a Port Authority, or what additional questions do you have? I mean, a lot of questions have come up. This was just intended to help you start the discussion and thinking, and to help bring forth, we're hearing very consistent things, nothing that's been talked about is different or out of line with other conversations we've had in other communities, which helps us focus in on the priorities from a countywide perspective. But what else could be helpful to help advance your discussions around housing or development, or the supports that maybe might come along with it?
Brent, did the port one time have a discussion, kind of like how you talked about, where port would essentially pick up houses that are relatively cheap, get them done on the studs, and then sell them? Or has the city done that? There had been discussion about that at one point.
I think we even talked about it as a port.
That's
like
what I
a year
thought.
ago.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, one of our biggest barriers to doing something like that is our own cash flow.
Right.
I like that idea, but
Well, the point is if you turn around like my property that I had, I mean, I paid 38,000 for it. And by doing that, she says the cash buyers are buying this stuff out. See, if the port had the cash flow to be able to say, okay, we're going to jump the gun and get to this before them, then we could still sell it to them at that price. And then like I said, I mean, they're going to get there. If you get somebody who has some, ambition, I mean, it's only like $5,000 to get, to go through and gut it yourself and everything else. Once you get that, then you get a contractor to come in and have them move the walls around and everything else. Because once you've gotten rid of the siding, the plaster and everything else, that's the hardest part. Just tearing down a wall and moving it, they can do that in an hour. If the house has been taken down to the bare studs. I mean, this way here, you'd be like using the city using us as, when we're the city, as a vessel to be able to help you with this. But then again, it's not like we're giving it to them. We're going to turn around and we're going to get in the way, and we're going to get ahead of the people who are going to basically turn it into a rental property that they never take care of. And then say, okay, well, we can get it now, maybe a little bit of administrative cost or something like that to cover our things. And then we put that out on the market. But the point is then they have to come in and do it, but then they also have to stay in it for so many years. Otherwise, they're going to turn around, flip it, make a profit, and then come back and hit us for another one. And then all of a sudden they sold it for $200,000-300,000, and then now some low-income family can't still afford it. You know, it's just people like me who are willing to do the work.
I think the issue is that it's, Amy said, they're cash buyers. So, there was a house on Adolphus recently that was like 50,000-ish. And I mean, and they had like 10 offers on it. I was talking to Ryan Henson, and basically they pretty much, even though it was 50,000, they pretty much turned it into an auction and said that, and literally after there was that many people going through it, that they said you have to put a bid in by noon on the following Monday, and the highest bidder will get the house. And so, as you say, then you're in a game of you can't beat them, because I mean, if you can write a check for 50,000 or 55,000, there's no bank involved. You don't have to worry about a down payment or anything like that. And I don't think we can get to those houses fast enough. And for the city to buy a house like that, we've got protocols we got to go through, blah, blah, blah. I mean, by the time we get to that, the auction's over. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they're not, if they know the city has a practice of this, they may just approach the city. We have somebody go out and inspect the house to see if it's structurally sound and worth our time. And then we say, okay, yeah, this is a house that can be rebuilt. The foundation is good. The framework is good. Now, this way here, by just selling it to us, they're not paying a real estate fee, realtor's fee or nothing. It would just be a cash transaction if we had that kind of funding with the Port Authority. And then, we turn around and just recoup the cost plus some administrative fees, with the understanding that this is what you must do with it. If you don't do it with this, then, there has to be a penalty for some fact of somebody trying to scam us. So, but this way here, we're putting it out there and trying to get a hold of these properties first, so they don't get turned into rundown rental properties.
So I'll ask the housing professionals, are there nonprofits or organizations that serve any functions similar to this that we could partner with? Or maybe Brent should start one?
I'm trying to get rid of my projects, not add on.
Well, we can add that to the list. Bill has got his hand up.
So one thing that comes to mind, where the city has done a little bit of this through our property abatement program, where a couple things have happened on rundown properties. They've been turned over to the city, just deeded to us. Now, of course, that doesn't enter the sale market, so we're not at that race to the finish line. But that's worked out in a couple scenarios very well, where one of the houses, then we sold it to a developer, they remodeled it, and that was like the perfect success story of what we all would want to see. So certainly we have had some experience with that as to the city level. And of course, we talked about that, like you said, at the port as well. Again, the trouble seems to be there's such a demand for these that the market is scooping them up so quickly. So but anyway, I just wanted to share how the city has done some of that through our property abatement program. So
yeah.
Have you all at MHP had experience with port authorities taking some vested interest in this and taking action?
In working in this detailed way on housing, is that your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'd be curious, Ella's experience. I certainly have seen other port authorities prioritize housing. I think it just ends up being, what is that priority, on the activities, because there's such a big range of activities that you could participate in. Kind of a example I'm more familiar with from the Metro right now is the St. Paul Port Authority. They are actually the entity that's working with the HRA to support many housing activities for the city of St. Paul.
Yeah, I personally don't have experience with port authorities, but I as far as I think we've actually been working a lot with economic development agencies who are finding that housing is very clearly within the wheelhouse of their economic development goals. And so I think that those sort of overlaps are increasingly common. So yeah, definitely there's precedent for it.
I'd be curious if the Duluth Port Authority was involved in, their community land trust project. We could look that up.
What is the relationship then with the St. Paul Port Authority and their HRA? How are they working together?
I will have to go back and look. And maybe Amy kind of knows. I think it's a little bit of how they've partnered on some large development opportunities and how that gets financed.
Yeah, I don't know any specific of how they've interacted. I think there's always, we've talked about partnerships and the value either from an expertise or the financing side of it that can come from those relationships. So I think thinking about who are the other partners that could be part of that bigger discussion would be a good route to go.
And just to chime in along with you on that, a lot of, and we've seen that with the Port Authority throughout history, is so often comes into play when you get something together and it's a financing mechanism again, too, has often been the case.
I do know of one community that was going to, they didn't execute on this, but the idea that's been talked about the rentals, that it was, creating that sum of money and not necessarily trying to get the ones before they, when they're, that too hard to get them when they're just going on the market, like was talked about, but looking at the single family rentals that are already in rental, and is there a pool of properties that might be able to be acquired in a lump and then rehabbed and sold to an income qualified buyer? That could be a different way to think about it. Then you're not going to, as talked about, it can be really hard to capture the home when it goes on the market, but then you also have the existing rentals. Is there a way to capture those properties in a different way? So just a different, again, they didn't execute on it, but it could be, again, when Bill talks about the financing side.
And it could be a lot like that property abatement program. Do we just make that bigger with the Port Authority or something?
Right.
Because, we've done, 1 year we acquired 3 parcels probably. And, one over on Vasa and 320 Elcott, I think, it's the ones that come to mind most recently that are success stories and are getting done. So it would be expanding something like that maybe.
Right.
And as long as the market stays like this, the city wouldn't have to worry about owning surplus property. I mean, it's not commodity, so.
And aren't we quite certain that we'll have a lot of seniors who will be moving out of single family homes? I mean, I know that there's been a lot of studies done around the region about our aging population. I don't know if we have a number, but if we could actually provide an incentive through a program for seniors.
Well, part of the incentive would be, especially if it's a house that we're looking for that's, kind of run down, but solid, is the fact is no realtor fees, closing costs, all that other stuff. It would just be a cash sale to the city, the Port Authority or whatever, on a fair price. And then, they'd be able to walk away from it.
Right. And, and the challenge then is, it's talk about is there another product for them to go into that is affordable?
Right.
That is a cost comparison to them. So that's, with that senior transition. And I think that was talked about. We talk a lot about Ben Winchester and his research, but he talks about capture them before they make the investments that are going to depreciate the value of that home. So before they make it fully accessible, that then is not a desired improvement to the next homeowner. So kind of a lot of ways to think about that. But I think we've captured the thoughts, and I know we have transitioned to another meeting here, but if there's anything else in writing that you want to provide that you didn't get a chance to share, certainly provide that to us. If you want to email it to Clara, she can get it over to MHP. And, we'll try to do a little summary document of the discussion to help you guys or to share with others as the conversation hopefully continues.
Can we just give it to Clara,
Yeah.
even if you might not be able to read our writing?
All right, well, thank you, Amy. Thank you to our guests from MHP and to our guests from Representative Fishbach's office. We appreciate you being here. If unless anyone has any last minute items, then we will adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you guys so
Caroline,
much.
I just need to make a few more revisions based on some